Millions of viewers tuned in that morning, expecting something familiar and reassuring. A calm start to the day, a well-lit studio, a recognizable host with a steady voice asking safe, predictable questions. The kind of interview that drifts by. While coffee brews and headlines scroll quietly along the bottom of the screen, nothing confrontational, nothing sharp. It's just another high-profile guest on a comfortable couch, smiling politely for the nation before most people had even fully woken up. But what unfolded live on national television was not a conversation. It was a slow, almost imperceptible collision, one that built not through raised voices or dramatic interruptions, but through silence, timing, and the careful placement of words. By the time Prince Harry pushed his chair back slightly, creating a subtle but unmistakable distance between himself and the desk, the studio itself seemed to stop breathing, and in that moment, George Stephanopoulos understood something crucial. This interview had crossed an invisible line, and there was no easy way back. The Good Morning America studio had been meticulously designed to disarm. Warm lighting softened. Every edge, neutral colors calmed the eye. A panoramic skyline backdrop turned New York City into something distant and almost unreal, quiet suggestion rather than a statement. It was a space built to lower defenses, to make even the most complicated stories feel manageable before breakfast. Nothing about the set suggested confrontation. Everything suggested comfort. Prince Harry sat on the left side of the curved desk, positioned carefully for the cameras. His shoulders were squared, his posture upright but not stiff. His hands rested loosely together, fingers interlaced and then released, a small movement that betrayed more tension than he likely intended. He wore a navy suit tailored precisely with an open collar that hinted at approachability. It was the familiar public posture of a man trying to appear relaxed while remaining acutely aware of every word, every glance, every reaction. Across from him, George Stephanopoulos listened quietly. His fingers rested on a neat stack of notes that, at least for now, remained untouched. His expression was polite, practiced, and deliberately unreadable. Years of political interviews, crisis conversations, and on-air pressure had trained him to reveal nothing prematurely. He didn't rush. He didn't fill silences unnecessarily. He waited around them. The panel smiled. There were nods of agreement, light laughter at the opening pleasantries, the visual cues of a routine morning broadcast. To the audience at home, everything appeared exactly as it always did. Another royal interview, another media moment, another controlled exchange between a famous guest and a seasoned journalist. But the tension was already there, subtle, it's almost invisible yet unmistakable. To anyone trained to look for it, it showed in the way. Harry's jaw tightened ever so slightly when George thanked him for coming on. In the brief, half-second pause before Harry answered the first question. In the way his eyes flicked toward the cameras, just for a moment, before returning to George's face. These were small details, easy to miss, but they told a different story than the calm surface suggested. George began exactly where everyone expected him to. So, Prince Harry, or Harry, if you prefer, he said smoothly. Thank you for being here. No mornings aren't always easy. A light chuckle rippled through the studio. It was gentle, practiced, and safe. The kind of opening line meant to relax a guest, to signal friendliness rather than challenge. Harry smiled in response. It was polite, controlled, a smile that reached the mouth before it reached the eyes. Happy to be here, he replied. Good to talk. George nodded, acknowledging the answer without lingering on it. Your book has sparked a lot of conversation, he continued, his tone even and unhurried. A lot of emotion. And you've said this is about telling your truth. Harry leaned forward slightly now, engaging more directly. That's right, he said. It's about honesty. It's about finally being heard. The word finally landed, heavier than the sentence required. It carried with it a sense of accumulation, years of frustration, resentment, and unresolved conflict compressed into a single syllable. George noticed. He always noticed. He didn't interrupt. He didn't react. He simply absorbed it and moved on. And you've also said, George continued calmly that this isn't about attacking your family. The studio felt quieter in that moment.
Ow.
Not silent, but focused. Harry's posture shifted again, subtle but meaningful. His hands tightened briefly before relaxing. His expression remained composed, but something behind it hardened. The question itself wasn't aggressive. It was reasonable, expected even. And yet, it carried weight, because beneath its neutrality was a challenge. This was no longer about promotion, no longer about headlines or sound bites. It was about intention, accountability, and contradiction. And both men knew it. The audience might not have felt it yet, but the air between them had changed. George hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't accused. He hadn't editorialized. He had simply placed the words on the table and waited to see what would happen next. And in that pause, brief, quiet, and loaded, the tone of the entire interview began to shift. Warm lights washed over the studio, in shades carefully chosen to soothe rather than stimulate. Neutral tones softened every edge, beige and muted blues blending seamlessly into the panoramic skyline behind the desk. New York, usually sharp and imposing, had been reduced to a gentle silhouette, distant and almost kind. It was the sort of set designed to lower defenses before the sun was fully up, to make complicated stories feel digestible before breakfast, to convince viewers that whatever was about to be discussed would remain polite, manageable, and safely contained. Prince Harry sat on the left side of the curved desk, shoulders squared but not stiff, hands loosely clasped in front of him, as though holding an invisible object. He wore a navy suit with an open collar, no tie, the deliberate uniform of approachability. It was a posture rehearsed many times, the posture of a man trying to look relaxed without ever quite allowing himself to be. Years of public scrutiny had trained him well. Across from him sat George Stephanopoulos, quiet, attentive, fingers resting on a neat stack of notes he had not yet touched. His expression was polite, practiced, and deliberately unreadable. The face of someone who had learned long ago that neutrality could be its own form of power. Around them, the panel smiled. On cue, heads nodded at the opening pleasantries. Soft laughter floated through the studio at the right moments, light and harmless. To the audience watching from their living rooms, kitchens, and bedrooms, it looked exactly as it always did. Another high-profile guest, another controlled morning interview, another carefully choreographed exchange designed to reveal. It's just enough without ever becoming uncomfortable. But the tension was already there. It lived in the small details, the way Harry's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly when George thanked him for coming on. In the half-second pause before Harry answered the very first question, in the brief flick of his eyes toward the cameras, as if checking where the exits were, before returning to George's face. These were the kinds of signals most people missed, but George did not. He had built a career on noticing what went unsaid. George began exactly where everyone expected him to. So, Prince Harry, or Harry, if you prefer, thank you for being here. I know mornings aren't always easy. A light chuckle rippled through the studio. Harry smiled. It was polite and measured, the kind of smile that arrived on time and left just as quickly. Happy to be here, Harry said. It's good to talk. George nodded. Your book has sparked a lot of conversation, a lot of emotion. You've said this is about telling your truth. Harry leaned forward slightly, as if the phrase had physically pulled him closer. That's right, he said. It's about honesty. It's about finally being heard. The word finally landed harder than it needed to. George noticed. He always did. And you've also said this isn't about attacking your family. George continued evenly. Harry's smile thinned, but it didn't disappear. Correct. But, George added gently, many viewers feel that some of the revelations feel deeply personal, even painful. Harry shifted in his seat. I think what people find uncomfortable, he said, voice calm but firm, is accountability. The panel exchanged quick glances. Everything still felt safe, controlled. George didn't push. Not yet. Instead, he pivoted. A classic Stephanopoulos move. You've spoken a lot about the media, he said. About how coverage shaped your life from a young age. It's how it shaped your marriage. Harry nodded immediately. This was familiar ground, comfortable even. The media created a narrative, he said, and it didn't stop. It never stops. George inclined his head. And yet, you've chosen to speak repeatedly through major platforms. The word repeatedly slipped by unnoticed for most viewers. Harry caught it. There's a difference between telling your story and being hunted, he replied. Of course. George said softly. But some critics would say critics aren't living my life, Harry cut in. The interruption was brief, almost nothing. But George paused anyway, not to challenge him, but to let the moment breathe. The studio air shifted just slightly. I understand that, George said calmly. But when you describe private conversations, private moments, they were weaponized against me first. Harry snapped back, sharper now. A beat. Harry realized he had raised his voice. He exhaled, forcing himself to reset. Sorry, he said quickly, it's just exhausting. George nodded sympathetically. Can imagine. He turned a page of his notes slowly, deliberately. Then almost casually he said, and yet, your family hasn't responded in kind. Harry's eyes hardened. They don't need to, he said. They have the institution. The word hung between them. Institution. George didn't smile this time. You have the microphone, he replied. The silence that followed wasn't long, but it was loud. Harry leaned back, crossing his arms now, posture shifting from open to guarded. I didn't ask for this, Harry said. I didn't ask to be born into that system. No one's suggesting you did, George replied. Then, gently, but you are choosing how you leave it. The panel stopped smiling. Harry laughed once, short and humorless. That's an interesting way to put it. Is it inaccurate? George asked. Harry's fingers tightened against his sleeve. I think, he said slowly, there's a tendency to reduce my experiences into sound bites that are comfortable for everyone else. George nodded. That's television. Harry stared at him. So is this, he said quietly. The words were calm, but they carried weight. George leaned back slightly, folding his hands. Let's talk about responsibility. Harry's expression changed. Not anger, not yet. Something colder, more deliberate. Whose? He asked. George didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked directly into the camera for a brief moment. A subtle signal to the audience. Everyone's, he said, including yours. The studio lights felt brighter now. Harry's leg bounced once under the desk. He smiled again, but it didn't reach his eyes. All right, he said, let's do that. And somewhere off camera, a producer felt a quiet knot tighten in their stomach. Because the interview had crossed an invisible line, and there was no going back. George didn't rush. He let Harry's words sit there, framed as agreement rather than challenge. The camera pushed in slightly. The set still looked warm, but the air no longer was. Responsibility, George repeated. You've asked for accountability from the institution, from the press, from people around you. So let me ask this plainly. What responsibility do you take for the damage this has caused? Harry's smile stayed fixed, like a sticker pressed onto glass. It didn't move. You're assuming damage, he said. I'm acknowledging impact, George replied. Families yours included are watching, people you've named or described, your brother, your father. Harry's jaw tightened. You mean the people who had an army of advisors writing statements about me for years? You're responding with a book? George said evenly. Interviews? A documentary? More interviews? He leaned forward. There's nobody. Listened when I was silent. When you speak, George said, you're asking the public to accept your version as truth. It is my truth, Harry said. George glanced at his notes for the first time, signaling a shift. Okay, he said. Let's take one specific claim. You've talked about private conversations. Critics ask, if you want privacy, why reveal private details? Harry exhaled through his nose, controlled. Privacy isn't the same as secrecy. George didn't react. Explain the difference. Harry glanced briefly toward the panel, then back. Privacy is a boundary, he said. Secrecy is what? Institutions demand so they can behave without consequences. The studio was silent, and for the first time that morning, no one smiled at all. So naming people as consequences, Harry's voice sharpened, the warmth drained from it. What had once sounded explanatory now carried an edge. Its reality. A coffee mug clinked lightly against the glass desk-can accidental sound. Brief and harmless under normal circumstances, yet unnervingly loud in the silence that followed. No one laughed this time. Away from Harry. You said you didn't want to attack your family, George said evenly. But you've described events that paint them in a very specific light. He paused, just long enough for the words to settle. Let me ask you this. Did you consider how your children will read this one day? Harry's eyebrows lifted, a flash of disbelief crossing his face. My children, he said, will read that their father didn't stay quiet while he was being destroyed. George's expression didn't change. It's not sympathy, not judgment, just steadiness. Destroyed by whom? He asked. Harry stared at him, the question landing like a provocation rather than an inquiry. By the machine, he said finally. George's mouth tightened slightly at the corners. It wasn't anger. It was something more restrained, fatigue perhaps. The look of someone who had heard this answer before, many times, in many forms. And, you've built a new life. Yes, Harry replied quickly, nodding as if eager to confirm the point. So why? George continued, his tone still calm. Does it still feel like you're fighting the same war every week on every platform? Harry's eyes hardened. The last trace of a smile disappeared completely now. Because they didn't stop, he said. Because they kept coming. George nodded slowly. The press. Harry leaned forward, the movement sharp and deliberate. In people like you? The studio froze. It was instantaneous. The way a room changes when an unspoken rule has been broken. The panel stiffened. Someone inhaled audibly and then stopped themselves. This wasn't just tension anymore. It was confrontation. George didn't flinch, but the panel did. The energy shifted from cautious to electric. People like me, George repeated, calmly. Harry's lips pressed together before he spoke again. People who sit behind desks and pretend they're being fair while repeating the same insinuations. George's voice remained measured, but it cooled by a degree. I'm asking questions, Harry. Harry shrugged, exaggeratedly casual, a gesture that didn't match the tightness in his jaw. That's what you call it. George held his gaze. And what do you call it? Harry didn't hesitate. A performance. George's jaw flexed once. He didn't respond immediately. The pause was deliberate, controlled. This was the moment where the balance of power recalibrated, where the host reclaimed the room, not with volume, but with restraint. All right, George said quietly at last. Then let's drop the performance. Harry leaned back in his chair, folding his arms again. Gladly. George tapped his papers once, a soft click against the desk. It wasn't nervous. It was precise. In your earlier interviews, George continued, you said there were briefings information planted about you, that the institution fed stories to protect others. Harry nodded firmly. Yes. Do you have proof? George didn't let the answer pass. I'm not questioning your experience, he said. I'm asking about evidence. Names, records, anything that substantiates the claim beyond personal memory. Harry's jaw tightened again. When you're inside it, he said slowly, you don't get to keep receipts. You survive. That may be true, George replied, but you're asking the public to accept serious allegations without verification. The public has watched it happen for decades, Harry shot back. They've watched narratives, George said, not process. Harry exhaled sharply through his nose. That's convenient. George didn't rise to it. It's necessary. Panel sat perfectly still now. No nodding, no sympathetic murmurs. The smiles had vanished entirely. You've said repeatedly, George continued, that this is about accountability. But accountability usually applies to everyone involved, not just those with more power. Harry leaned forward again. You're suggesting equivalence? I'm suggesting responsibility, George said. For what? Harry asked. For speaking? For impact? George replied. For escalation. For naming people who haven't. responded, "Who won't respond?" "'Cause they don't have to," Harry said. "They have protection." "And you have amplification," George countered. The silence stretched. Harry looked down briefly, then back up. "You think I enjoy this?" he asked. "You think this is comfortable?" "No," George said. "I think it's effective." Harry laughed once, short and sharp. At last. Honesty. George didn't smile. Effectiveness isn't the same as righteousness. Harry's fingers drummed once against the arm of the chair. "So what would you have me do?" he asked. "Disappear quietly." "Accepted." "Would have you answer the question," George said calmly. "What responsibility do you take for the fallout?" Harry's voice lowered. "I take responsibility for telling the truth." "No." "And if that truth hurts people who didn't consent to its telling?" George asked. Harry's eyes flickered. "That's the cost of silence ending." George leaned back slightly, "or the cost of choosing a public reckoning." Harry stared at him. "You make it sound optional. Everything after leaving was—" "Optional," George replied. The words landed heavily. Harry didn't respond immediately. When he did, his voice was quieter, more controlled than it had been all morning. "You don't leave something like that and just walk away clean," he said. "It follows you." George nodded. "Then perhaps the question isn't why you keep fighting," he said, "but whether this fight ends the way you think it does." Harry held his gaze unmoving. The camera lingered on the two of them. The warm set lights suddenly feeling harsh, almost interrogative. Somewhere behind the scenes, a producer glanced at the clock and then at the floor. Knowing the segment had gone somewhere it wasn't supposed to go, and knowing there was no pulling it back now, the performance, if it had ever been one, was over. What remained was something sharper, messier, and far more difficult to contain.